Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters across the world, welcome. Today, we shine a light on a legacy that mainstream narratives often try to dim. The voices of African leaders who spoke truth so bold, so fearless, that the world had no choice but to listen. These are not just political figures. They were visionaries, warriors of truth, and defenders of dignity. From podiums, battlefields, and prison cells, they spoke with fire, conviction, and clarity. Their words weren't just speeches, they were weapons against injustice. Welcome to African Diary 24, the channel where Africa speaks for itself. From powerful stories and rich cultures to political realities and grassroots movements, we bring you content that informs, inspires, and challenges the narrative. Whether you're here to learn, connect, or explore, you're in the right place. This is Africa, unfiltered, unapologetic, and rising. Hit that subscribe button and become part of the journey. Disclaimer: the content featured on African Diary 24 is for informational, educational, and documentary purposes only. We aim to represent stories with accuracy and integrity, but the views expressed in interviews or commentary do not necessarily reflect those of the channel. We do not promote hate, violence, or political bias. Viewer discretion is advised, especially for sensitive topics. Always do your own research and think critically. Let's begin with Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso, who became a global icon of anti-imperialism. He once said, "He who feeds you controls you." With that single sentence, Sankara challenged the entire global aid system, exposing how food aid was being used to trap African nations in cycles of dependency. But he didn't stop at words. He cut government salaries, banned luxury cars for officials, and redistributed land to the poor. He renamed Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning land of upright people. Sankara's truth was simple. Africa does not need charity. Africa needs justice, sovereignty, and self-reliance. And that shook the very foundations of Western diplomacy, which is why his voice was silenced too soon. Next, we remember Muammar Gaddafi, the controversial but unapologetic leader of Libya. Love him or hate him, Gaddafi dared to dream of a united Africa, with one army, one currency, and one government. He called for the African Union to stand strong against Western influence and proposed a gold-backed dinar to free African economies from the dollar trap. At the United Nations, he stood boldly and tore up the UN Charter, accusing the Security Council of being undemocratic, calling it the terrorism of the powerful. His truth made headlines, not because it was polite, but because it was disruptive. It shook the world. And just like Sankara, his fate was sealed by powers that feared an Africa rising. Then there was Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister. In his famous independence speech in 1960, Lumumba defied Belgium's king, refusing to praise colonialism and instead declaring, "We are no longer your monkeys." That speech stunned the West. It wasn't what they expected from a new African state. But Lumumba wasn't playing the game. He exposed the horrors of colonialism, demanded justice, and vowed to build a Congo for Congolese. And for that, he paid with his life. His assassination was not just a political hit. It was a warning to all African leaders who dared to speak such unfiltered truth. Part 4. Nelson Mandela, the peacemaker with fire. Many know Nelson Mandela as a peaceful symbol of reconciliation, but few remember the radical truths he spoke, especially in the early years. In his 1964 speech before being sentenced to life in prison, Mandela declared, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Even from behind bars, his voice echoed around the world. He called out apartheid not just as a South African issue, but as a crime against humanity that global powers were tolerating, and in some cases supporting. His truth embarrassed world leaders, but his unwavering stance helped awaken the conscience of the planet. Today, we're witnessing new leaders emerging with Sankara-like boldness. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta of Mali, and Chiani of Niger, rejecting Western military presence and calling out neo-colonial influence openly. They're saying what many African leaders whisper in private: Africa must control its own destiny. These are not just political moves. They are statements of independence, unity, and identity. Their words, whether on African soil or international stages, are shaking the post-colonial order. So why do these words shake the world? Because truth, when spoken by the oppressed, becomes a threat to the oppressor. It reveals injustice, it exposes hypocrisy, and it inspires the masses. The African leaders who spoke truth, and those who still do, remind us that Africa is not a continent to be pitied. It is a continent to be respected. May their words continue to echo. May their courage continue to rise in the hearts of the next generation. Because Africa is no longer asking for permission to speak. Africa is speaking loud and clear. Emperor Haile Selassie, who stood before the League of Nations in 1936 after fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia. He warned the world, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." His words rang like thunder in a hall full of indifference. He condemned the betrayal of global powers who stood by while his nation bled. And though they mocked him then, history proved him right. World War II followed just years later. Selassie's voice wasn't just for Ethiopia. It was a cry for all oppressed people across the globe. He reminded the world that injustice anywhere would soon become a threat everywhere. Decades later, in the founding of the African Union, he again spoke boldly, saying, "Until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, the dream of peace remains a dream." Those words were immortalized in Bob Marley's War, but they were Selassie's truth, and they shook the world. Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda, a leader who speaks with sharp clarity and no apology. After the 1994 genocide, Kagame did what many thought impossible. He rebuilt a nation from ashes, but he didn't stop at healing Rwanda. He turned his gaze outward. In speech after speech, Kagame has called out global double standards, Western arrogance, and the manipulation of African narratives. At the African Union and UN, he has asked hard questions. Why is Africa always spoken for, judged, and assisted, but never respected? Why must African progress be validated by those who once colonized us? Kagame's words challenge power structures and force uncomfortable truths into the open. He speaks with the authority of experience, and the world listens, even if reluctantly. Truth without fear. They exposed injustice. They demanded respect. They spoke for Africa, not as victims but as equals. Their words shook the world, and more importantly, they woke Africa.
Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. Kwame Nkrumah. These are not just words. These are weapons of truth spoken by Africa's most fearless leaders, from Thomas Sankara to Paul Kagame, Haile Selassie, Mandela, Lumumba, and the rising voice of Ibrahim Traoré. They have dared to challenge the status quo, to question the decisions made by their counterparts in Europe that affect us all. And in doing so, they have given voice to millions of Africans who feel unheard. But their stories are often untold, their bravery goes unrecognized. In this episode, we celebrate these courageous leaders who have stood up for what they believe in and demand that their voices be heard. We will explore how they have used their platform to make a difference in the world and how their actions have inspired others to do the same. Get ready to be inspired by the courage of these extraordinary individuals and discover how their stories are shaping our future. Let's start by asking a simple yet profound question. Why do African leaders need to speak out against Western policies? The answer is clear. It is because we have a right to be heard. Our opinions matter and our voices deserve to be amplified. For too long, African nations have been marginalized in global affairs. Decisions about our future have been made by Western powers without our input. It's time to change that narrative. We live in a world where every voice matters, where every perspective shapes the global discourse, and where every nation has a right to be heard. Africa is not just a continent rich in resources. It's a continent rich in potential, talent, and ideas. Yet for far too long, our voices have been drowned out by those of more powerful nations. It's time to break that silence. It's time for African leaders to speak out and be heard. Imagine a world where African leaders come together to form a united front, where they speak with one voice, unafraid, undeterred, and unstoppable. What if they use this platform to challenge the unfair practices that have held back our continent for years? What if they stand up for our rights and demand a better future for generations to come? The possibilities are endless. Consider the impact they could have on global issues such as climate change. African nations are on the front lines of this crisis, yet our voices have been sidelined in international negotiations. What if our leaders step up and demand that developed nations take responsibility for their historical emissions and support us in our efforts to adapt and grow sustainably? Picture the ripple effect this could have. It would send shockwaves across the globe, forcing everyone to take notice and demanding action. Take, for example, the issue of poverty. Millions of Africans live in extreme poverty, struggling to access basic necessities like healthcare, education, and food security. What if our leaders use their platform to call for fairer trade practices that prioritize the needs of African consumers? Imagine them advocating for policies that support small businesses and create sustainable jobs. Just think about the positive impact it could have on millions of lives. What if these leaders go further and tackle the root causes of conflict in our region? Civil wars and ethnic violence continue to plague many African countries, causing untold suffering and instability. Picture our leaders coming together to promote peace, dialogue, and understanding across borders. What if they champion initiatives that invest in education, healthcare, and infrastructure in conflict-ridden areas, working towards a future where peace prevails over conflict? And let's not forget the power they hold when it comes to preserving our cultural heritage. Africa is home to diverse cultures, languages, and traditions that have enriched our world. Yet many of these are under threat due to globalization and cultural homogenization. What if our leaders unite to protect and promote our cultural diversity? Imagine them supporting initiatives that preserve our languages, promote cultural exchanges, and celebrate our unique traditions. It's time for African leaders to write a new chapter in our continent's history. A chapter where our voices are strong, where our perspectives are valued, and where we actively shape our own destiny. Let us look at some African leaders who have dared to defy the odds and speak truth to power. Our first story is about a visionary leader, His Excellency Paul Kagame, the President of Rwanda. He has emerged as a strong advocate for Africa's interests on the global stage. One significant achievement of his leadership is the successful organization of the 26th African Union Heads of State and Government Summit in 2018, which aimed to address pressing issues affecting the continent and promote unity and integration among African nations. This event was a testament to President Kagame's dedication to advancing African causes on the world stage. Additionally, he played a pivotal role on the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, a landmark initiative aimed at creating a single market for goods and services across Africa. By reducing trade barriers and promoting intra-African trade, President Kagame has been instrumental in driving economic growth and integration across the continent. Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, is next. At just 34 years old, he is the world's youngest president and has already made a significant impact. After leading a military coup in September 2022, he pledged to prioritize the welfare of his people and the security of the nation. In January 2023, he addressed the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, calling for unity and collective action among African countries to address common challenges. Traoré's speech highlighted the need for African nations to focus on their own development and resist external pressures to align with Western interests. He emphasized that true freedom could only be achieved through Pan-Africanism and unity among African countries. President Traoré's bold and inspiring message has resonated with many young Africans who see him as a symbol of hope for a better future. Now let's turn our attention to Egypt, where President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has been making waves on the global stage. In September 2022, during the Russia-Africa Economic and Humanitarian Forum in St. Petersburg, President Sisi made headlines by questioning Western policies and their impact on developing countries. He boldly called out double standards and urged developed nations to acknowledge their historical responsibilities in contributing to global problems. President Sisi's outspoken nature has made him a controversial figure, but he remains committed to standing up for the rights and interests of African countries. Another leader who has been unafraid to speak his mind is Kenya's President William Ruto. Ruto surprised many when he openly criticized the West for what he perceived as neo-colonial practices and meddling in the internal affairs of African countries. During his inauguration speech in September 2022, he called for a new narrative in foreign policy that prioritized African interests and rejected attempts to dictate how African nations should be governed. President Ruto's stance reflects a growing sentiment across Africa towards greater self-reliance and a rejection of Western dominance. Finally, we have the remarkable story of Fokk Bagbadi, the former president of Ghana who tragically passed away in March 2023. During his time in office, President Bagbadi fearlessly advocated for African unity and liberation. He played a pivotal role in the formation of the Organization of African Unity, now known as the African Union, and served as its first chairman. President Bagbadi's commitment to the African cause was unwavering, and he remained a vocal critic of colonialism and neo-colonialism throughout his life. His legacy continues to inspire leaders and citizens across the continent to fight for a more just and equitable world. As we celebrate these extraordinary individuals, let us also recognize that their journeys were not without challenges. Each of them faced obstacles and setbacks, but their determination to stand up for what they believed in never wavered. They serve as beacons of inspiration for future generations of African leaders. In conclusion, the stories of these African leaders demonstrate that our voices matter. When our leaders speak up and speak out, they have the power to challenge the status quo and drive positive change. From President Kagame to Ibrahim Traoré, President Sisi, President Ruto, and the late President Bagbadi, these individuals have shown us that we have a right to be heard on the global stage. As we move forward, let us continue to amplify their voices and support their efforts to create a better future for Africa and the world. Together, we can build a world where every voice is valued and every nation is respected.